Welcome to my channel. I'm Ben. Today, we step into a haunting case from rural Shandong, where the body of a tall man was discovered in a dry village well, stripped bare, his skull marked with brutal axe wounds. Strangely, no one in the village could identify him, and the only clue left behind was a red Santana sedan abandoned nearby. Who was this man? And why did his life end at the bottom of that forgotten well? In the summer of 2010, the rural village of Wangbi in Shanghai County, Shandong Province, lived in a rhythm as old as time. Rice paddies stretched in green waves, dirt paths wound between houses, and at the center of daily life stood the village well, a narrow shaft where families came to draw water or wash their tools. No one in this quiet farming community could have foreseen that this familiar well would soon yield a secret so dreadful it would scar their memory for years to come. On a humid morning, an elderly farmer named Wang passed by the well and stopped abruptly. A foul stench rose from the shaft, thick and sour, the kind of smell that clung to the back of the throat. At first, he thought it must be a dead animal that had fallen inside. But the smell was too strong, too unrelenting. Driven by unease, he leaned closer. As his eyes adjusted to the shadow below, his heart seized. In the murky water, pale and rigid, protruded the unmistakable outline of a human foot. Panic coursed through him. He stumbled back, ran to the nearest house, and shouted for help. Within minutes, neighbors gathered, voices rising in disbelief as they circled the well. Some covered their mouths, others whispered rumors, and all waited for the arrival of the authorities. The local police sealed off the site and summoned the homicide unit from Shanghai County. The retrieval of the body was grueling. The well was narrow, barely wider than 16 inches, and deep enough that ropes and pulleys were needed, piece by piece. Rescuers worked until, at last, the body emerged. When light struck it, a wave of horror spread through the crowd. The corpse was that of a man, tall, nearly 6 feet, weighing close to 200 pounds. He was naked, stripped of every belonging. His skull was fractured, his face covered with sharp, clean axe wounds. The investigators estimated he had been dead anywhere from 3 months to 1 year. The scene spoke of deliberate concealment. The killer had removed clothes, jewelry, shoes, any object that could aid identification. By dumping the body in water, they sought to mask the odor of decay and hide the crime for as long as possible. But this effort at tidiness, this attempt to erase identity, raised more suspicion than it silenced. Whoever had done this knew the village, knew the well, and believed they could rely on silence and darkness to bury the truth. News traveled quickly. In a community where violent crime was rare, the discovery shook every household. Whispers spread. Perhaps the dead man was a drifter, or maybe he had been killed in revenge. Some wondered aloud if the corpse belonged to someone they knew. But the only certainty was the brutality of the wounds and the cruelty of the disposal. For police, the first step was to compare the body against missing persons from the region. One name emerged: Wang Haivian, a local poultry farmer who had been absent for more than a month. Wang was known for debts and disputes. His family rushed to the scene and, confronted with the body, declared at first that it must be him. Yet measurements soon cast doubt. The corpse was tall and heavily built. Wang Hivin had been slight, only about 5 feet 5, thin from years of hard work. Even his relatives hesitated. Could this be someone else entirely? Confusion deepened when another clue surfaced: a red Santana sedan, parked and abandoned near a repair shop on the village's edge. bore the registration of Wang He-vian. It had stood there since late January, untouched. Investigators opened the trunk. Inside, under the lining, they discovered drag marks, as though something heavy had been hauled across the floor. A single leaf, stained with dark brown, caught their attention. Laboratory tests confirmed what instinct already whispered. It was human blood. Now the threads began to twist together. The body in the well was not a random stranger. The abandoned car linked the crime back to Wang He-vian. But if the dead man was not Wang, then who was he? And more pressing, where was Wang himself? The villagers, standing at the cordon line as police worked, felt unease spread like a shadow. A corpse with axe wounds, a car abandoned with blood inside, and a missing farmer whose debts had long been whispered about. The evidence formed the shape of a mystery too large for them to grasp. For the investigators, it was only the first step into a labyrinth, one that would reveal how deceit, desperation, and betrayal had collided beneath the quiet surface of rural life. The discovery of the body had turned Shanghai police into hunters of shadows. Their task was now twofold: identify the corpse pulled from the well and determine the fate of Wang He-vian, the missing farmer whose car had been left abandoned with traces of blood. The villagers, restless and fearful, watched as investigators combed through every possible lead. The red Santana became the first anchor point. Forensic teams studied every inch of the vehicle. The drag marks in the trunk told of something heavy being forced inside. Under the worn lining, strands of hair were retrieved, fragile but intact. When compared against the dried blood on the leaf, the results confirmed both belonged to the same individual. Yet the identity of that individual remained unknown. Attention shifted back to Wang He-vian. His disappearance now looked less like flight and more like a deliberate absence tied to the body. Rumors painted him as a man crushed by debt he had borrowed from relatives, neighbors, and even small-time lenders in nearby towns. When he vanished, many assumed he had fled to escape repayment. His abandoned car seemed to support that theory. But the corpse told a different story. The man in the well was taller, heavier, built like a stranger. Wang He-vian's own family, once certain, grew hesitant. This cannot be him, they admitted after closer inspection. The uncertainty gnawed at the investigation. Who was this man? Why had he been transported in Wang's car, stripped, mutilated, and hidden? And most importantly, where was Wang? To answer, police turned to DNA analysis. Rural laboratories lacked the resources, so samples were sent to provincial experts. Weeks later, results arrived with a revelation that startled even seasoned detectives. The body was identified as Han Ban Li, a man of 30 years from Tianjin, over 300 miles from Shanghai. His record showed petty thefts and short stints of casual labor, nothing to suggest he would end up dead in a village well far from home. The revelation deepened the mystery. How did a man from Tianjin find his way to this obscure village in Shandong? And what linked him to Wang He-vian? Tracing Ban Li's background, police uncovered a critical connection. He was the cousin of Han Baoshan, another man from Tianjin, several years older, with a reputation for idleness and minor trouble. Witness statements began to align. Villagers remembered two tall strangers frequently in Wang's company earlier that year, men who ate and drank with him but never worked the fields. They recalled heated arguments spilling from a derelict house on the edge of the village. Voices raised in anger, then suddenly silenced. The picture was slowly forming. Ban Li had not wandered to Shanghai by chance. He had come with his cousin, drawn into Wang's orbit for reasons not yet clear. And now, only one remained alive. Han Baoshan. Forensics added further weight. The blood in the Santana trunk matched Ban Li's DNA perfectly. The leaf-stained brown had fallen there when his body was hauled. The signs were undeniable after being killed. Ban Li's corpse had been stuffed into Wang's car, then dumped in the well. But this raised more questions than it answered. If Ban Li was dead, what role had Wang played? Was he the orchestrator, a partner, or perhaps the next victim waiting his turn? His debts, his affair with Zhang Hongha, and his sudden disappearance all pointed to a man entangled in something far greater than financial misfortune. For villagers, whispers turned darker. Some muttered that Wang had invited demons into their community, that his debts had drawn dangerous outsiders who brought blood and ruin. Others speculated he himself had been killed and buried somewhere unknown. Fear spread with each passing day. Police, however, focused on the surviving cousin. If Ban Li was in the well, then Baoshan held the answers. He was the thread left dangling in the knot. Investigators now faced the daunting task of tracing him, understanding his relationship with Wang, and uncovering why two men from Tianjin had traveled so far only for one to end up dead and the other vanished. The well had given them a corpse. The car had given them blood, but the story still lacked its center. Until they found Bao Shan, or Wang, the mystery remained a shifting fog, dense, deceptive, and dangerous. Identifying the corpse as Han Banli shifted the entire weight of the investigation. The man in the well was not the missing farmer Wang Haivian, but an outsider, a drifter from Tianjin, more than 300 miles away. The revelation unsettled the police because it raised more questions than it answered. Why had Ban Li come to Shanghai, and how did his path cross with that of Wang? Digging into Wang's background, investigators found a man whose life was crumbling long before the first blow was struck. He was in his 40s, ran a poultry farm, and was well known in the area, not for success, but for his debts. Neighbors described him as a man who always owed someone money, who borrowed in desperation and promised repayment that never came. By the time he vanished, creditors had started appearing at his door daily, demanding what he could not provide. Debt was not Wang's only burden. In the shadows of his personal life, he carried an affair with Zhang Hongha, the wife of his distant relative Zhang Benling. In a conservative village, adultery was more than betrayal. It was social shame. For a woman like Hongha, divorce was nearly impossible, carrying the weight of disgrace. The affair with Wang was reckless but intoxicating, and together they dreamed of a life free of obstacles. In their minds, the only obstacle was Benling himself. The affair became the seed of something darker. Wang and Hongha whispered about eliminating Benling, and for this purpose, Wang sought help beyond the village. He turned to the cousins from Tianjin, Han Baoshan and Han Banli, men with little to lose. Both were known for idleness and petty crime, living off small hustles and borrowed money. When offered a chance at easy cash in exchange for murder, they agreed. The plan seemed simple: kill Zhang Benling. But murder is rarely simple, and incompetence doomed the scheme from the start. According to witness testimony and reconstructed timelines, Baoshan and Ban Li tried repeatedly to carry out the deed. Once, they used a crude, silenced pistol, but the weapon jammed. Another time, they staged a car accident, waiting to ram their target. But Benling changed his route at the last moment. In another attempt, they planted an improvised bomb near a path he often took. But the device barely shattered windows, causing no injury. Each failure drained the money Wang had advanced. The cousins, instead of leaving, lingered in the village. They drank, gambled, and flaunted themselves, becoming a source of anxiety and resentment for Wang. He had invited wolves to his door, and now they were feeding off him while failing to deliver. The villagers noticed. They saw Wang walking with two tall strangers, men who did not belong, who carried themselves with a swagger foreign to farming life. Some even overheard furious arguments from an abandoned house, Wang's voice clashing with theirs before silence fell. Rumors began, but no one dared intervene. For Wang, fear grew alongside anger. He was trapped between obligation and exposure. He had paid killers who could not kill, and if they chose to speak, his affair with Hong Ha and his murderous plot would be revealed. Meanwhile, the cousins themselves began to fracture. Trust between them eroded. Bao Shan suspected Ban Li of scheming to pocket the rest of the money. Ban Li, tired of failures and fearful of Wang's pressure, suspected Bao Shan of betrayal. In this volatile triangle, Wang found an opportunity. He whispered to one cousin about the other, feeding suspicion, planting seeds of discord. He believed that by pitting them against each other, he could regain control. It was a dangerous calculation. In his attempt to control chaos, Wang only deepened it. By the spring of 2010, the plot had collapsed. Zhang Benling lived, oblivious to how close death had circled him. Han Banli was dead in the well. Han Baoshan had vanished, leaving behind silence and unanswered questions. And Wang himself, the man who had set it all in motion, was still missing. For investigators, Part 3 of this grim saga painted a clear but incomplete picture. They now knew why the cousins had come to Shanghai, and how Ban Li had become entangled in the plot. They saw Wang not as a victim, but as a manipulator, the mastermind who had hired killers for love and desperation. Yet the story refused to settle. The body in the well answered one mystery, but gave rise to another. Who had killed Ban Li, and what had become of Wang Hevian? The villagers whispered late into the night. They spoke of blood money, of debts that summoned death, of outsiders who brought ruin. The police, piecing together evidence, knew one thing with certainty, until they uncovered the fate of Wang Hevian and found Han Baoshan. The case was far from closed. What they had uncovered so far was only the outline of a much deeper labyrinth. Once the body in the well was identified as Han Banli, investigators were forced to confront the next and perhaps most pressing question: what had happened between the two cousins? And how had a plan meant to kill Zhang Benling turned into Ban Li's death? The deeper the police delved, the clearer it became that the failed assassination attempts had not only drained Wang Haivian of money, but also poisoned the trust between the men he had brought to Shanghai. Villagers remembered the cousins' presence vividly. They had arrived with Wang early that year, and their height and swagger made them stand out in a community of bent-backed farmers. For weeks, they lingered, walking the paths, drinking in small eateries, and shadowing Zhang Benling. People whispered about strangers in their midst, but they did not know the extent of what those men intended. Later testimony confirmed that the cousins had indeed tried multiple times to kill Benling, but each attempt dissolved into failure. For Wang, each failure was a tightening noose. He had promised money he no longer had, borrowed more to keep the killers placated, and watched as their arrogance grew while their results dwindled. He quarreled with them, sometimes loudly enough for neighbors to hear through the walls of a derelict house. But anger alone did not solve his problem. The killers now knew his secret. If they abandoned the plan, they could expose him. It was in this pressure cooker that Wang made a fateful choice. To protect himself, he began whispering lies to both cousins, carefully crafted to turn them against each other. To Bao Shan, he suggested Ban Li intended to run off with the money. To Ban Li, he hinted Bao Shan was preparing to betray him. Suspicion grew like mold in damp air. The cousins, once bound by blood, began to treat each other as rivals. The tension reached its breaking point in late May of 2010. Witnesses reported hearing raised voices on a remote field beyond the village. No one intervened, believing it was just another quarrel among outsiders. But forensic evidence later revealed the grim outcome. Ban Li had been struck repeatedly on the head with an axe, the reinforced blade leaving fractures across his skull. The blows were deliberate, sharp, and fatal. He collapsed on the ground. His life ended not by the man he had been hired to kill, but by his own cousin. In the aftermath, his body was stripped naked. An attempt to remove anything that could identify him, he was dragged across the earth. The marks later confirmed by soil traces on his skin and hauled to the old village well. In the dark of night, his corpse was shoved into the narrow shaft. Bao Shan believed water and darkness would swallow the crime. But within weeks, the smell betrayed him. The car, the blood, the leaf, and the body all confirmed the sequence. Ban Li had been transported in Wang's red Santana before being discarded in the well. The very car that linked back to Wang now became the bridge between mastermind and victim, proof of complicity that Wang himself could no longer deny, though by then he had disappeared. For investigators, this was a grim irony. Wang had tried to manipulate the cousins to protect himself. Instead, his whispers had unleashed paranoia that ended in Ban Li's murder. Far from controlling the chaos, he had fueled it, creating a crime he had not planned, but one for which he bore indirect responsibility. The villagers who had seen the three men together now realized they had witnessed a partnership collapsing into bloodshed. They remembered the arguments, the unease, the way Wang looked thinner and more anxious each passing week. Some admitted they had suspected trouble, but no one imagined it would culminate in a corpse pulled from the well. For the police, Ban Li's death was both a revelation and a riddle. It revealed how the murder-for-hire scheme had imploded, consuming one of its own players. But it left unanswered the question of Bao Shan's fate and, more critically, Wang's. With Ban Li dead, Bao Shan vanished, and Wang missing. The investigators were left with only fragments of a labyrinth. The body in the well provided proof of violence, but it did not yet reveal the full story. What was clear was this: Han Bao Shan had killed his cousin in a fit of suspicion and rage, spurred on by the manipulation of Wang Hivian. But Wang himself, the man who had once seemed the puppet master, was nowhere to be found. It was as though the roles of victim and perpetrator had begun to blur. The case had not reached its climax. It was only deepening, turning darker, as investigators realized the true scale of betrayal and murder concealed beneath the surface of this quiet village. The corpse in the well had finally been given a name: Han Ban Li. But naming the dead did not end the mystery. It only sharpened the shadows around it. Investigators now faced a chilling reality. Ban Li had been killed not by the man he was hired to assassinate, but by his own cousin, Han Bao Shan. And somewhere in the background, pulling strings and sowing suspicion, was Wang Haivian, the debtor farmer whose life of secrets had already spiraled out of control. Villagers remembered how the two cousins had been inseparable when they first arrived from Tianjin. They walked together, ate together, even lounged in Wang's yard as though they belonged there. But in the weeks before Ban Li vanished, people noticed a change. He seemed nervous, spoke less, and often walked a few steps behind his cousin. Once or twice, heated arguments were overheard, sharp words carried by the wind from the edge of the fields. At the time, no one dared intervene. Only later did they understand those quarrels were the cracks before the collapse. For Wang, the collapse was no accident. Investigators uncovered how he had whispered lies into each cousin's ear. To Bao Shan, he suggested Ban Li intended to steal the money promised for the killing of Zhang Benling. To Ban Li, he hinted that Bao Shan planned to abandon him and take everything for himself. It was a calculated ploy, meant to divide and weaken them, so that Wang could reclaim control. But control was the one thing he never achieved. In late May of 2010, under the cover of night, suspicion finally exploded into violence. Bao Shan confronted his cousin on a remote field, words escalating into shouts into blows. The weapon he carried was an axe, its head reinforced for heavy work. Forensic analysis later showed the fractures on Ban Li's skull matched such a blade. The repeated strikes were not the random chaos of a brawl. They were deliberate, brutal, and final. Once Ban Li lay lifeless, Bao Shan stripped him of clothes, dragging his body through the dirt. Soil particles embedded in his skin testified to the rough handling. Then, with the help of Wang's red Santana sedan, the corpse was transported to the old village. Well, it was there, in the darkness and stagnant water, that Ban Li's remains were hidden. Bao Shan believed he had erased his crime. He had only postponed its discovery. The car itself betrayed the story. Blood traces in the trunk matched Ban Li's DNA, the same as the body in the well. Even a single leaf stained with blood inside the vehicle became damning proof. What seemed like small, forgettable details were, to forensic science, unshakable evidence. For investigators, the conclusion was inescapable. Han Bao Shan had killed his cousin, and Wang Hevian had indirectly engineered the death by manipulating them. The murder-for-hire scheme to kill Zhang Benling had failed entirely, but its failure had birthed another tragedy. Yet, as one riddle was solved, another loomed larger. Wang himself had vanished. No trace, no sightings, no explanation, beyond cryptic text messages sent to his family. The texts, with their clumsy kinship terms, convinced detectives they had not been written by him at all. Bank records showed untouched funds, further proving he had not fled. The absence was too neat, too hollow. If Ban Li was dead and Bao Shan had disappeared, then what had become of Wang? In Shanghai, villagers whispered darker tales. Some said Wang had paid with his life, buried in secret, just as he had once planned for others. Others speculated Bao Shan had killed him too, vanishing back to Tianjin with blood on his hands. But the forensic timeline placed Bao Shan in Tianjin long before Wang disappeared. That left the chilling possibility that someone else, someone closer, had ended Wang's story. For the police, the well no longer held the deepest secret. It was Wang's disappearance, sudden and absolute, that now pulled them forward. The man who once seemed the orchestrator had become the missing piece, and the case that began with a foul smell rising from a village well was about to grow far darker. The murder of Han Ban Li might have explained the corpse in the well, but it did not explain what had become of Wang Hevian. As investigators pieced together the story, they began to realize that the man who once seemed to be the puppet master was himself missing in a way that could no longer be ignored. His absence was not the panicked flight of a debtor, as many villagers first believed. It was something far darker. At first, The family of Wang clung to the idea that he had run away to escape his debts. They received text messages from his phone, short and abrupt, claiming he was alive, but far away. "Do not worry about me," one read. Another said, "I am hiding. Do not look." On the surface, these messages fit the narrative of a man on the run. But investigators noticed details that ordinary villagers overlooked. In one message to his paternal uncle, the sender used the word brother. In rural China, kinship terms are sacred, precise, and ingrained. Wang would never have used such a word to address an elder relative. That mistake was enough to cast doubt on the authenticity of every message. The financial records confirmed those doubts. Wang had more than 10,000 yuan still in his account, untouched since the day he disappeared. A fugitive would need money for trains, food, lodging, but here, the balance was frozen. If Wang had truly fled, he would have drawn upon that money. The untouched account was, to detectives, as loud as a scream. Wang was not hiding. Wang was dead. Investigators reconstructed his last known day with forensic precision. Meteorological records showed that on March 9th of 2010, Shanghai experienced its only day that month of combined fog and light snow. Several villagers recalled that morning clearly because of the unusual weather. One said he saw a minivan parked near Wang's home, with a man in his 30s waiting by the door. Another said Wang entered the vehicle after a brief conversation. He was never seen again. By aligning weather data with eyewitness accounts, police fixed the disappearance to that date with chilling certainty. Suspicion initially fell upon Han Baoshan, but train records showed he had left Shanghai in late January, weeks before Wang vanished. His presence in Tianjin during March was confirmed by work logs. He could not have been the man in the minivan. That left only those within Wang's immediate circle, and one name rose to the surface: Zhang Benling. Zhang was the man Wang had once plotted to kill, the husband of his lover, the obstacle in his way. If anyone had reason to silence Wang, it was Zhang. At first, this seemed only speculation, but fragments of evidence began to connect. Neighbors recalled Zhang making a strange remark months earlier: "If I ever killed a man, I would never dump him in a well. I would burn him clean." At the time, it was dismissed as idle talk, but in hindsight, it sounded like a blueprint. Police began combing through cremation records from nearby counties. On March 10th, one day after Wang vanished, a cremation certificate recorded the death of an elderly man named Ding. But a cross-check revealed that the same Ding had already been cremated in 2008. A man cannot die twice. The duplicate record was evidence of forgery, and only someone with access to funeral documents could have arranged it. That access belonged to Zhang Benling. Investigators searched the funeral shop where Zhang worked. It was a modest building, filled with the tools of mourning, wooden chairs, incense, and ledgers. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. But one old chair drew attention. Its surface bore faint brown flecks. To the eye, they could have been coffee stains, long dried. Under forensic light, they glowed unmistakably as human blood. DNA analysis confirmed the blood matched the son of Wang Hevian, proving it had come from Wang himself. The horror settled in. Wang had not fled. He had been lured to the funeral shop under pretense, beaten until he collapsed, and then disguised as the long-dead Ding. His body was fed into the crematory, his ashes scattered, his existence erased. The texts from his phone were theater, written by another hand to mislead his family. The untouched bank account, the forged papers, the blood on the chair, all threads woven together into one damning tapestry. For detectives, the realization was staggering. The man who once schemed to kill had himself been killed. The mastermind had become a victim, and the intended victim had become the murderer. It was a reversal as cruel as it was complete. The villagers, who had whispered of outsiders bringing death, now had to confront the truth that the danger had come from within, from a man they had known all their lives. The case, once anchored in the stench of a body in a well, had now revealed its darker heart. Ban Li was dead at the hands of his cousin. Bao Shan had vanished, and Wang had been burned to ash by the man he had sought to eliminate. Each death, each disappearance, was not an isolated act, but a chain reaction of betrayal and revenge. And yet, even as the picture sharpened, the story was not over. Zhang Benling still lived freely, and until he was confronted, the truth remained buried under layers of lies. Just as Wang's ashes had been hidden beneath false paperwork, the trail of evidence that pointed toward Zhang Benling was too sharp to be coincidence. Investigators had in their hands a forged cremation record, a blood-stained chair, and DNA that spoke louder than any testimony. Still, Zhang maintained his innocence. He insisted that Wang Hevian had fled under the weight of debt, that he had nothing to do with the disappearance. But the walls were closing in, and Zhang's words carried less weight with every piece of proof laid against him. At the station, detectives pressed harder. They showed him the duplicate cremation file, recorded under the name of Ding, a man who had already been cremated 2 years earlier. They reminded him that only someone with access to funeral records could have forged such a document. Zhang tried to brush it aside, claiming clerical error. But when they presented the DNA test, confirming the dried flecks on the funeral shop chair matched Wang's blood, Zhang faltered. His lips trembled. His eyes darted from wall to floor. Hours stretched into silence. Finally, he confessed. The story he told was chilling. On March 9th of 2010, Zhang had lured Wang to the funeral shop under the pretense of a conversation. Also present was Li Wenxi, a funeral worker loyal to him. There, Zhang confronted Wang about the affair with his wife, Yang Hongha, and about the plots that had nearly cost him his life. When Wang denied and deflected, Zhang's rage erupted. With Li's assistance, they beat him with wooden sticks until he collapsed, blood soaking into the chair. Wang was dead within minutes. From there, Zhang turned to his professional tools. He had access to death certificates, records, and the crematory itself. Using Ding's old file, he falsified the paperwork to disguise Wang's corpse as that of the long-dead man. The body was burned the following morning. Ashes were scattered into the river, carried away by the current. Nothing remained but traces. Blood on wood, ink on paper, whispers in the village. This confession reframed the entire case. Wang Hevian, once seen as the puppet master who hired killers, was himself reduced to ash by the very man he had targeted. Fate had twisted cruelly. The would-be victim became executioner, and the conspirator became the victim. When the case went to trial, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the benches. Villagers crowded the aisles, and the atmosphere bristled with tension. 4 names dominated the docket: Han Baoshan, Zhang Benling, Zhang Hongha, and Li Wenxi. Each represented a different face of the same tragedy: greed, betrayal, rage, and complicity. Prosecutors laid out the evidence with precision. They showed how Wang and Hong Ha plotted to eliminate Ben Ling, how the cousins from Tianjin were brought in as killers but failed, how suspicion fractured them until Bao Shan murdered Ban Li. They described how Wang, desperate and manipulative, sowed division that backfired, and how finally Ben Ling himself silenced Wang through murder and cremation. The chain of events was both complex and brutally simple. Each act of betrayal fed into the next, until the circle closed in blood and fire. The sentences reflected the weight of each crime. Han Baoshan, convicted of killing his cousin, was given the death penalty with a 2-year reprieve. Later commuted to life imprisonment. Zhang Benling received life in prison for intentional homicide, his plan to erase Wang undone by forensic science. Zhang Hongha, the woman at the center of the affair, was sentenced to 11 years for conspiracy and concealment. And Li Wenxi, the funeral worker who helped cover the crime, received 9 years. As the verdicts were read, the courtroom fell into heavy silence. Some villagers wept. Others shook their heads in disbelief. For them, this had not been the story of strangers, but of people they knew. Neighbors who had shared their markets and festivals, to learn that within their community had unfolded a chain of affairs, debts, and murders left scars that would not heal quickly. For the investigators, it was confirmation of a lesson they knew well. No crime is perfect. Zhang had thought his funeral trade would give him the tools to erase Wang. He forged, he burned, he scattered, yet a single record checked against another. A single drop of blood, preserved on a chair, was enough to unravel his careful facade. The cousins had thought they could kill for money and walk away. Yet incompetence and paranoia destroyed them. And Wang himself had thought he could manipulate others to solve his problems. In the end, his lies caught up with him, leaving him a victim of the very man he sought to eliminate. The trial did more than convict individuals. It revealed how ordinary lives, when twisted by greed, desire, and fear of shame, could spiral into extraordinary violence. It showed that betrayal has a ripple effect, moving from bed to field to funeral parlor, consuming everyone in its path. For Shanghai, the village where it began, the story became both a caution and a curse. They would carry its weight long after the courtroom lights dimmed. When the sentences were handed down and the courtroom emptied, many assumed the story had reached its end. Yet for the investigator, the journalists, and the scholars who later dissected the case, the true work had only begun. To understand how such a chain of tragedies unfolded, one had to look not just at the evidence, but at the minds and motives of those entangled in it. This was no single act of madness. It was a collision of desperation, desire, pride, and betrayal that spiraled into death. At the heart of it all stood Wang Haivian. By outward appearances, he was an ordinary man, a poultry farmer struggling to make ends meet. But beneath the surface, his life was unraveling. Debt was crushing him. Each month he borrowed more, paid less, and watched creditors gather like vultures at his gate. Rather than seek lawful remedies, bankruptcy, mediation, even public admission of failure, he chose deceit. His affair with Zhang Hongha gave him a taste of forbidden intimacy, and together they imagined a future that required only one obstacle to be removed. Zhang Benling. Wang convinced himself that removing Benling would solve his debts, his shame, and his longing all at once. In reality, it sealed his fate. The psychology of Wang was a toxic blend of greed, cowardice, and fantasy. He wanted escape without responsibility, love without consequence, and money without repayment. Zhang Hongha, for her part, represented another facet of the tragedy. In the conservative village, divorce was unthinkable. To leave her husband would mean gossip, disgrace, and uncertain survival. Instead, she chose the secrecy of an affair. When Wang whispered of murder, she did not resist, whether through fear, dependence, or shared desire. She allowed herself to become a conspirator. Her silence was her complicity. In the eyes of the court that earned her 11 years in prison, in the eyes of her community, it cost her something greater: her reputation, her family, her place in the village's memory. She became not just a prisoner, but a cautionary tale, whispered among women about the price of forbidden choices. The cousins from Tianjin entered the picture for simpler, baser reasons. Han Baoshan and Han Banli were not motivated by love or shame, but by greed. Both had records of petty theft and idleness. When offered money for murder, they accepted with eagerness, treating it like another hustle. Yet greed without skill is ruin. Their attempts failed, one after another, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Bao Shan grew suspicious, Banli anxious. Their bond of blood, fragile to begin with, cracked under pressure. Wang's manipulation widened the gap until Bao Shan turned his axe on his own cousin. For one man, it meant a corpse in a well. For the other, it meant a lifetime behind prison walls. Their story was proof that even family ties can be corroded by money, that loyalty built on greed collapses as soon as fear enters the room. And then there was Zhang Benling, the man who began as a victim but ended as a killer. To the villagers, he was the wronged husband, betrayed by his wife, targeted by outsiders. But inside him simmered resentment and rage. He carried the humiliation of infidelity and the bitterness of being marked for death. When the opportunity came, he did not turn to law or divorce. He turned to violence. His work at the funeral shop gave him the tools to hide what he had done, and in his mind, it must have seemed perfect. If the others had failed in secrecy, he would succeed. For a time, he did. Wang's ashes, scattered in the river, seemed to erase his existence. Yet even Zhang could not escape the truth that there is no perfect crime. A single blood fleck on a chair and a duplicate cremation record unraveled his illusion. His psychology revealed the corrosive power of shame. Unable to bear public disgrace, he chose murder to restore his sense of control. But in doing so, he joined the same darkness that had once targeted him. Forensic science exposed each of them, but psychology explained why they acted. Wang's fear of debt, Hong Ha's fear of gossip, Bao Shan's greed, Ban Li's desperation, and Ben Ling's rage. All these forces collided like flint and steel. What emerged was not a single crime, but a cascade. Each decision led to the next. Each betrayal fueled the next, until the entire circle was consumed. For investigators, the case became a study in the fallacy of what they called false tidiness. Every participant believed they could tidy away their sins. Wang thought text messages and manipulation could disguise his failures. The cousins thought killing could buy them easy money. Zhang thought forged papers and cremation would erase a man from existence. But false tidiness is never complete. A message with the wrong word, a corpse too large to be mistaken, a record that contradicted itself. Each tiny crack widened until the entire facade collapsed. For the villagers, the psychological fallout was immense. They had watched neighbors they knew transform into figures of betrayal and blood. They realized that evil did not come only from strangers or outsiders, but could grow inside familiar walls. The gossip they once feared became irrelevant in the face of real horror. What they carried afterward was not just fear of crime, but fear of themselves, of what people like them could become when shame and greed outweighed morality. The case stood as a mirror, reflecting not only four criminals, but the vulnerabilities of a community. It was a reminder that every affair whispered in secret, every debt left unpaid, every resentment allowed to fester, has the potential to erupt into consequences far beyond what anyone imagines. The psychology of the Shanghai tragedy was not alien. It was human, painfully human, and that was what made it so terrifying. When the trial concluded and the sentences were announced, the shock rippled far beyond the walls of the courthouse. In Shanghai County and throughout Shandong Province, newspapers reported the outcome with headlines that blended disbelief and fascination. Yet for the villagers who had lived closest to the case, the impact was far more personal. They had not simply read about a murder, they had lived alongside it, sharing streets and markets with the people who had become killers and victims alike. The silence that settled over the village in the weeks after the verdict was heavy. For some, it was grief. For others, it was shame. Neighbors whispered that it all began with nothing more than an affair, a secret between Wang Hivian and Zhang Hongha that could have ended with divorce, but instead escalated into conspiracy. From there, debts, greed, and suspicion pushed one act of betrayal into another until 3 lives were destroyed and several others bound in chains of imprisonment. The villagers struggled to understand how something so ordinary could have metastasized into something so lethal. Those who remembered the outsiders, the tall cousins from Tianjin, spoke of hindsight. They recalled how the men stood out, how they drank and argued, how Wang looked thinner and more anxious as the weeks passed. Many admitted they had sensed something was wrong, yet none dared to intervene. Fear played a role, but so did indifference. Family matters are family matters. One villager later told reporters that silence, born of habit and caution, gave space for crime to grow unchecked. The investigators who closed the case drew their own lessons. For them, it was an example of how criminals believe in illusions of cleverness. Wang believed text messages would hide his absence. The cousins believed violence could be carried out quietly. Zhang believed forged paperwork and cremation could erase a man's existence. Each of them underestimated the persistence of truth. A blood fleck on a chair, a contradictory cremation file, a careless kinship term. In a text, these details, insignificant on their own, were enough to unravel the entire web. Families bore the deepest wounds. The children of Wang Hivian grew up in the shadow of contradiction, knowing their father was both conspirator and victim. Han Ban, Li's relatives mourned his death, but also carried the shame that his killer was his own cousin. Bao, Shan's elderly mother, traveled long distances to visit him in prison, separated by glass, knowing she would die before seeing her son free again. Zhang Hong, Ha's years in prison were marked not just by confinement, but by the knowledge that her family name was now a stain in the village record. Li Wenxi, once a humble worker at the funeral shop, became infamous for his role in covering a murder in his 9-year sentence, leaving his relatives to endure the whispers of disgrace. The press described the case as the tragedy of false tidiness. It was a phrase that captured the heart of the story. Each participant tried to tidy away their sins. Wang by manipulation, the cousins by murder, Zhang by fire. But crime leaves residue. False tidiness is never perfect, and in the gaps, left behind ashes scattered too neatly. Papers that did not match, stains on wood, the truth emerged. For the villagers, the lesson was harsher. They realized that evil does not always arrive as an intruder from outside. It can grow within, in the silence of neighbors, in the secrets of families, in the choices of ordinary people. The well at the village's edge became more than a water source. It became a symbol of what can happen when secrets are buried instead of faced. Children were warned not to wander near it, not because of danger of falling, but because of the story it now carried. Even years later, Shanghai residents spoke of the case in hushed tones. They remembered not just the corpse pulled from the well, but the smell that lingered, the police cordons, the way the village felt smaller under the weight of scrutiny. For them, the verdicts did not end the story. They lived with its aftershocks every day. Reminders that behind closed doors, behind polite greetings, betrayal and violence had been hiding all along. The case, closed in legal terms, remained open in memory. It was both a warning and a scar. A warning that secrecy and greed can corrode the fabric of family and community, and a scar that no sentence or confession could erase. Etched deep into the identity of a village that once thought itself ordinary until the day the well gave up its dead. The legal chapter of the Shanghai tragedy closed with the verdicts, but the echoes carried far beyond the courtroom. For legal scholars, investigators, and ordinary citizens, the case posed a haunting question. How could a story that might have ended with divorce or financial mediation instead unravel into a chain of killings? Experts pointed to the unique intersection of psychology, culture, and law. In rural China in the year 2010, reputation and gossip weighed heavily on personal choices. For Zhang Hongha, divorce was nearly unthinkable, promising disgrace and survival on uncertain terms. For Wang Hevian, admitting bankruptcy or public failure was a humiliation worse than crime. Instead of facing exposure, they chose secrecy, believing death could silence shame. This revealed how social pressure can twist personal choices, pushing ordinary people toward extraordinary crimes. The case also highlighted the arrogance and ignorance of those who thought themselves clever. Wang believed he could manipulate others with whispered lies and fake text messages. The cousins from Tianjin thought violence could be executed like a simple business deal. Zhang Benling thought cremation paperwork and scattered ashes could erase a man's existence. Each underestimated the reach of forensic science. A blood fleck on a wooden chair, a duplicated cremation record, a kinship term used wrongly in a message, small cracks that became fault lines, splitting apart their carefully built facade. From a legal perspective, the sentences reflected clear differentiation of responsibility. Han Baoshan received the harshest penalty, a death sentence with reprieve, later commuted to life for killing his cousin. Zhang Benling was sentenced to life imprisonment for intentional homicide and concealment. Zhang Hongha, though not a direct killer, was sentenced to 11 years for conspiracy and concealment. Li Wenxi, the funeral worker who assisted, was sentenced to 9 years. The gradation of penalties illustrated how the court weighed both degree of participation and nature of the act, principles at the core of criminal law. Yet the broader meaning of the case could not be measured in years of confinement. It carried a message beyond legal statutes, that crime cannot remain hidden under layers of false tidiness. Each participant tried to bury their actions under secrecy, but each left behind traces that betrayed them. In this sense, the case became a cautionary tale for investigators and citizens alike. For the people of Shanghai, it was more than law. It was a lesson carved into the memory of a village, that betrayal within families, greed unchecked, and silence in the face of wrongdoing can devastate an entire community. The well where the corpse was found no longer served merely as a water source. It became a symbol, a reminder that secrets buried in darkness will eventually rise to the surface.